I think we're ready to start. Clay, if you'd like to.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, welcome everyone to the Reflections Spring 2025 lecture. Before we introduce today's speaker, let me say a few words about this series. In case you don't know me, I'm Kleanthes Grohmann, Professor of Biolinguistics and Director of the CAT Lab at the University of Cyprus. And on the other side of the pond, it's Dr. Lydia Grebenyova, Senior College Lecturer and Director of Linguistics at Cleveland State University. Jointly, we welcome you to the 7th installment of the Reflections online lecture series. Reflections is Lydia's brilliant brainchild, our virtual space where we celebrate generative syntax with a focus on its foundations and developments. We are doing that by asking long-standing scholars in the field to reflect on the early work and to connect it to the current state of the art. By doing so, they are basically tracing the history of the field for us in a wonderful manner and letting everyone have a glimpse at what it was like for them to be part of all those developments. We've already had 6 amazing lectures by Robert May, Richard Kane, Hagit Bourrea, Howard Lasnik, Robert Frieden, and Adriana Belletti, some of whom are joining us today, which is great. And you can also watch their lectures on YouTube, as you can watch this one on YouTube very soon. We'll put a link in for the YouTube channel into the chat, just in case you haven't seen those lectures yet. And of course, our Reflections website also provides additional information. This includes upcoming talks. So for example, in June, we will have Rita Manzini. In September, Lisa Travers will talk to us. And for January 2026, we have Luigi Rizzi. The link to the website will also be posted in the chat. And if you haven't already, please register with the Reflections lecture series through the website. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. And for our older participants, you can also find us on Facebook. Please note that once registered, you don't need to email us again or re-register. We old school, Lydia and I, and we enter all new requests by hand, which means that if you've already registered, we will have to process your new request regardless, only to discover that you're already in our mailing list. So once registered, you're on the mailing list, you're in. You don't have to do it again. So let me just close with a few brief housekeeping matters. Please turn on your cameras so we can see your friendly faces and perhaps leave them on during the lecture as well. Keep yourself muted unless you're asking questions. And of course, we're saving all questions until after the presentation. If possible, keep discussions in the chat to a minimum so as not to distract the speaker and the audience too much. And lastly, we will paste the above links in today's handout, I hope, once I get this, in the chat in a moment, and then again in a little while for those joining us a few moments later, because once you join YouTube, you can't really, Zoom. Once you join Zoom later, you can't really access the previous chat. So I will put these links on a few times throughout the talk. Speaking of which, Lydia will now introduce my undergraduate mentor and BA Honors thesis supervisor from around 30 years ago, the esteemed Professor Ian Roberts, Fellow of the British Academy and unfortunate supporter of Manchester United.
All right. By the way, the file is already in the chat, the handout, so you can print it out or download it if you like. Yes, I'm very, very happy to introduce our today's speaker, Ian Roberts, who is a professor of linguistics at the University of Cambridge. Ian received his PhD in linguistics from University of Southern California in 1985. And since then, he's become a leading contributor to the field of comparative and historical linguistics. He has 13 monographs and the same number of edited volumes and journals. Very, very prolific and numerous. I stopped counting last night after 100 of journal articles, book chapters, and conference proceedings papers. So lots and lots of work. but it's not just his quantity, but the quality of his work that we appreciate so much. I find it theory forward with lots of innovative analyses and great empirical and explanatory reach. And because of such good quality, Ian is very successful in getting substantial grants for his projects, which is very difficult in theoretical linguistics, as you, I'm sure, know. He's also such a great role model in holding over 40, having held over 40 invited honorary teaching positions all over the world. And I know a great number of his students are in the audience as they were registering in great, great numbers. So he's a great teacher, and I met Ian only once at a conference, and I can share that after my talk in the audience, he asked a very good question, and it was one of those great questions that presents a tiny issue with your analysis, but also a solution for it. So it was very generous, and as a graduate student, I was very honored to get a question from him like that. So very, very happy to welcome Ian Roberts with the talk Against Input Generalization, Evaluation Matrix in Generative Grammar. So without further ado, let's welcome Ian.
Hi.
Yes, you can
Hi.
start sharing your slides now, Ian.
Yeah, okay. Just a second. Um, uh, okay, can everyone see that? And can everyone hear me? You don't need to see me. In fact, maybe you'd be better off without seeing me, but as long as you can see the handout and hear me, that's what matters.
Yes, we see you
So,
and hear you. It's working
okay,
great.
thanks. So, yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to give this talk, and also for the very kind introduction. My topic does have a certain personal connection, which may not be immediately obvious, but I'll get to that as we go along. So let me just dive straight in to what I want to discuss. So when I first decided to give a presentation on evaluation metrics in generative grammar, I Googled for evaluation metrics, and basically you get an awful lot of stuff in machine learning and related matters and very little linguistics. But there is a very interesting paper. There is a very interesting paper by John Goldsmith, which came up. From 2013. And I found that gave a sort of good, an interesting kind of starting point. Because essentially one of the things about the concern with evaluation of grammars that is a theme throughout the whole history of generative grammar, as I'll try to sort of show, is that it's something that really does distinguish generative grammar from, I think, nearly all other traditions in linguistics. For example, if we compare generative grammar with the immediately preceding dominant paradigm in North America, American or post-Bloomfieldian structuralism. Basically, it was very widely held that as long as you had an analysis, a description, or a taxonomy of some data set that you were interested in, then that was fine. Any analysis was as good as any other. And it may be that, well, essentially the notion of best analysis doesn't really hold. Any analysis is a good analysis or good enough if it covers what you're interested in. And so there is a sense in which there could be multiple best analyses. And there was no real sense of evaluating analyses in relation to one another in any internal sense. And no sense of what a best analysis might be in any internal sense, independently of simply covering whatever data you were looking at. And in generative grammar, right from the very beginnings, as I'll show in just a moment, in Chomsky's very earliest work, this assumption was essentially rejected. And the idea was always that there would be a right analysis. That is, even if we have two analyses which are equally valid in terms of data coverage or whatever other external criterion of validity you want to use, the idea would be that there would be an evaluation metric which could distinguish the two analyses and essentially eliminate one or the other. And so the question of how to evaluate analyses, and then more widely how to evaluate grammars, immediately arose. So what I want to do is first give a brief historical overview of evaluation metrics in generative grammar. It'll be very brief and somewhat sketchy on certain points. Then I'll take an excursus into diachronic linguistics, which is what will link up with my own personal interests, and then look at evaluation metrics and principles and parameters, particularly the lectures on government and binding approach. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that I and others here did, Anders Holmberg notably, on the Rethinking Comparative Syntax project. Then I'll come to the other part of the title of the talk, which is arguing against a particular evaluation metric, namely input generalization. And finally, I'll talk about some very recent work that I've been doing in collaboration with Dalina Kaluli on rethinking the Berer-Chomsky conjecture. The connections amongst these things will, I hope, become clear as we go through the talk. So let's then begin at the beginning, and the beginning is morphophonemics of modern Hebrew. There, already in this very early and pioneering work, Chomsky came up with the notion of evaluating analyses in terms of simplicity. And he also very early at this stage, I think, already articulated the relationship between the grammatical notation that we choose to use and the notion of evaluation. So there are essentially these two things, what we can call the fixed notation and the evaluation metric. And a fixed notation is required in order for evaluation to work at all, i.e. the two analyses or the two grammars that you're comparing have to share a fixed notation so that you know you're comparing like with like. And that was already an extremely important step because it essentially meant that there had to be some grammatical meta theory which determined how you would actually write and then evaluate and compare the two grammars. So early in Morphophonemics of Modern Hebrew, Chomsky says, given the fixed notation, the criteria of simplicity governing the ordering of statements are as follows: that the shorter grammar is the simpler, and that among equally short grammars, the simplest is that in which the average length of derivation of sentences is least. And he goes on to say, simplicity is increased by reduction of the number of symbols in a statement, and reduction of the length of derivations. And of those two notions, in fact, the first one is arguably the one which has had the most influence. But this is a very early statement of the basic idea, which recurs throughout all of the work in generative grammar, I think, up until around the beginning of principles and parameters theory, where things take on a slightly different guise, maybe not as different as they at first appear, but a somewhat different guise anyhow. So moving on then to LSLT, and here I'm just giving a couple of quick quotations from that monumental work. So one point that Chomsky makes in his early discussion of the general nature of the theory he's developing is, he says, this abstract theory of linguistic structure must provide a practical and mechanical evaluation procedure for grammars. The abstract theory must have the property that for each language, the highest valued grammar for that language that meets the external criteria of adequacy set up for the given language. So the external criteria of adequacy can be various things, but the simplest thing to take them to be is simply conformity with native speaker intuitions. And then he also goes on to say we can measure the simplicity of a grammar by measuring the length in symbols of the sequence of conversions. The term conversion there corresponds to rewriting rules or phrase structure rules as they became known in later versions of generative grammar. So again, we have the notion of comparing grammars and the idea that the notion of simplicity is the criterion for comparison. The simpler grammars are better grammars, and that simplicity is measured in terms of length in symbols. Okay, so those ideas are all there present at this very early stage. Moving on to syntactic structures, as many of you will know, there's a chapter called On the Goals of Linguistic Theory, I think it's chapter 6, where these issues are also discussed. There, Chomsky makes a distinction since he's sort of coming out of the earlier structuralist tradition in American linguistics, he makes a distinction between discovery procedures, decision procedures, and evaluation procedures. In fact, that distinction is also made in LSLT. And with these, he says that actually evaluation procedures, although the weakest of the three, are the ones that should be favored. So he says, given two proposed grammars, G1 and G2, the theory must tell us which is the better grammar of the language from which the corpus is drawn. The assumption being that we derive a grammar from a corpus somehow. Again, that comes from structuralism, really earlier work. And he says, this theory may not tell us how to go about constructing the grammar of a given language from a corpus, which a discovery procedure was supposed to do. But it must tell us how to evaluate such a grammar. It must thus enable us to choose between two proposed grammars. And he says that this is the right move to make, to move away from discovery procedures and towards evaluation procedures. As he says, lowering our sights to the more modest goal of developing an evaluation procedure for grammars, we can focus attention more clearly on really crucial problems of linguistic structure, and we can arrive at more satisfying answers to them. Our ultimate goal, he goes on to say, is to provide an objective, non-intuitive way to evaluate a grammar once presented and to compare it with other proposed grammars. We are thus interested in describing the form of grammars, equivalently the nature of linguistic structure. And again, notice that in order for this to be feasible at all, as he points out both in LSLT and in syntactic structures, one has to have a meta theory of what a possible grammar can be. And so we already have a sort of nascent notion, the term wasn't used at that time, but we essentially have a notion of the theory of possible grammars, namely universal grammar. That is required in order for the notion of evaluation to work at all. And then, of course, since evaluation requires optimization, finding the optimal grammar, then we already have a notion of, well, essentially aiming towards the optimal description or explanation of a given set of linguistic data. So the notion of evaluation plays a crucial role also in the notion of explanation. This becomes still clearer, I think, in aspects where in chapter 1 there's a whole section devoted to evaluation procedures. And here also we see for the first time, well, not exactly the first time, but the first time very clearly an emphasis on the evaluation procedure in relation to language acquisition as well. So he says in this section in chapter 1 of aspects, a child who is capable of language learning must have a technique for representing input signals, a way of representing structural information about these signals, some initial delimitation of a class of possible hypotheses about language structure. So the first two are kind of obvious. The third one means some notion of UG as we would now think of it. Fourth, a method for determining what each such hypothesis implies with respect to each sentence. In other words, taking the initial delimitation of possible hypotheses and building analyses for each sentence based on that. And fifth, a method for selecting one of the presumably infinitely many hypotheses that are allowed by three, the initial delimitation of the class of possible hypotheses, and are compatible with the primary linguistic data. So the fifth point is the evaluation metric. So in other words, the notion of this is, I think, the first time where the concept of how language acquisition took place was articulated, and this was the concept that held through the standard theory and the extended standard theory periods until we come to the principles and parameters models starting in the 80s. So the idea then is that the child is equipped with some initial delimitation of the class of possible hypotheses, in other words, some notion of a possible grammar, and a way of determining, of analyzing the primary linguistic data in terms of that grammar, and then a way of selecting the optimal hypothesis based on the optimal version of that grammar that will be compatible with the data the child is exposed to. And it was assumed that there would be infinitely many possible hypotheses compatible with the data, and the best one has to be chosen. Chomsky goes on to say, a few pages later, that the evaluation procedure, that is 5 here, is necessary for explanatory adequacy. It's not sufficient, but it's necessary in order to attain explanatory adequacy. So again, we see the crucial role played by evaluation metrics in the development of the theory here. And again, evaluation is phrased or couched in terms of simplicity, which is a notion to be defined within linguistic theory. It's not an a priori notion. It's not some general notion of theory construction taken from outside of linguistics. It's a notion to be defined within linguistic theory, along with a notion like grammar or phoneme and so on. And again, the obvious numerical measure to be applied to a grammar is length in terms of number of symbols. But if this is to be a meaningful measure, it is necessary to devise notations and to restrict the form of rules in such a way that significant considerations of complexity and generality are converted into considerations of length, so that real generalizations shorten the grammar and spurious ones do not. So again, it's the same idea that we saw already in Morphophonemics of Modern Hebrew, LSLT syntactic structures, but refined and sharpened here. And again, we see the interaction between the evaluation metric and how we restrict the notations and the form of rules in order to arrive at an evaluation. So the interaction between evaluation and restrictiveness, and therefore explanation, is very clear and very central in the theory at this stage. And again, one special case of this general approach to evaluation that has been worked out in a particularly convincing way is the condition of minimization of distinctive feature specifications in the phonological component of the grammar. And here, in fact, he cites several early works by Maurice Halley, and clearly this actually foreshadows the sound pattern of English, which we'll get to in just a moment. And again, another quotation from that same section, a person learning a language will attempt to formulate generalizations that can easily be expressed, that is, with few symbols, in terms of the notations available in this theory, and that that's the language that was used at the time, he will select grammars containing these generalizations over other grammars that are also compatible with the given data, but that contain different sorts of generalization, different concepts of natural class, and so on. So again, the idea that limiting the description length will lead us to formulate the optimal generalizations, lead us to the most highly valued grammar, which will be the explanatory grammar, both from the point of view of internally to linguistic theory and also from the point of view of language acquisition. And finally, in this historical overview, well, at least pre-1980s, we come to the sound pattern of English, which I think is probably the place where the evaluation metric was most clearly articulated in relation to distinctive feature theory in phonology as it was put forward in that work. So again, so here we see another quotation. The degree of linguistically significant generalization attained by a grammar, its simplicity in a technical sense of the term, is measured by the number of symbols appearing in the underlying schema. So this should be kind of familiar by now. But here's a very, very clear statement of it. This is a principle that was put forward later on in chapter 8 of SPE. The value of a sequence of rules is the reciprocal of the number of symbols in its minimal representation. Okay, in other words, fewer symbols, higher value, very directly. So this principle 9, as it is there, together with a specific choice for an alphabet from which the symbols are selected, and a specific set of notations for formulating rules and schemata, provides a precise explication for the notion linguistically significant generalization. So again, we see the same notions as in the earlier work, but now made very sharp and very precise in the context of phonological theory. Here again, this is from, I think, chapter 9 now. The complexity of a system is equal to the sum of the marked features of its members. There's a whole discussion of distinctive features defining vowels, and they basically show that among 5 vowel systems, the number of marked features you need to distinguish A, I, U, E, O gives you a complexity of 6. Whereas other clearly more marked systems like I, U, E, O, E, and has a complexity of H, and then the crazy one with U, E, and so on has a complexity of 10. So the system which we know to be the most cross-linguistically widespread comes out as the least complex one, the least marked one, in terms of a very precise numerical feature counting evaluation measure, counting marked features in this case. And also the 3-vowel system, AIU, is the simplest possible, a conclusion that seems to be supported by its predominance over other 3-vowel systems in the languages of the world. So here we actually see a typological dimension emerging now from this approach to evaluation. So to conclude this very brief a little historical overview of evaluation metrics in the early days of generative grammar, I think a few observations we can make are, first of all, that evaluation metrics are necessary in linguistic theory, which, as we began by saying, is a major departure from earlier thinking in pre-generative linguistics, certainly in American structuralism. And in fact, as pointed out in aspects, evaluation metrics are necessary for explanatory adequacy, although not sufficient. Constraints on rule systems, which of course we're very familiar with, are also required. But the two things interact, as we've seen. An evaluation metric can only be meaningful in relation to a constant grammatical notation, neutral to any particular grammar, as already stated in Morphophonemics of Modern Hebrew. And so they entail really the presence of a grammatical meta-theory, which we now think of as universal grammar. And there are two notions of evaluation metric. Again, this distinction is made already in LSLT, but it's made more explicit in aspects, I think, or at least it's discussed at more length. So there's the methodological notion for the linguist simply trying to come up with the optimal analysis of whatever it is. And then there's the psychological notion, which is the child discovering its grammar, building its grammar. Finding the optimal hypothesis that covers the primary linguistic data given universal grammar, given its predisposition for certain types of rule systems and so on. And the criterion for evaluation is fairly consistently length in a general sense, that is, the number of symbols or the number of features. And this is made particularly clear in sound pattern of English. So that's the historical overview, which I think is interesting because I think it shows the centrality and importance and originality of the role of evaluation metrics in generative linguistic theory and in Chomsky's thinking in the early days. But I think that there's a continuity, as we'll see as we go on. And just a final consideration, which I've already touched on, but it's worth emphasizing. The simplicity of linguistic theory is a notion to be analyzed in the general study of philosophy of science. The simplicity of grammars is a notion defined within linguistic theory. So what we're interested in here is simplicity of grammars. Okay. As I say, this point is made in different guises in basically all the things we've looked at, but that one quotation states it particularly clearly. Okay, so now I want to move on to talk a little bit about diachronic issues. And this is where perhaps the personal side of things comes in. My interest in evaluation metrics stemmed from my interest in trying to account for language change, in fact, more specifically, syntactic change. And I think that the notion of evaluation of grammars is crucial in this domain, as I'll try to show now. I've worked on this in one guise or another, on and off, for a long time. So, okay, in uh, some work I did with Robin Clark, a paper that came out in LI in 1993, we identified what we referred to as the logical problem of language change, which was clearly picking up on earlier discussions of the logical problem of language acquisition. And in fact, the term is due to Robin Clark, not me, originally. The basic point is this: we can define uh, change, and particularly syntactic change, but in fact not only syntactic change, as follows. So under the appropriate idealizations, a change is initiated when a population of language learners converges on a grammatical system which differs in some formal respect from the system internalized by the speakers whose linguistic behavior provides the input to the learners. Or to put it very simply, the younger generation somehow converges on a grammar which is different from the older generation's grammar, although the primary linguistic data that they're exposed to is produced by the older generation's grammar. And so the point is this, the logical problem is this: if the primary linguistic data for one generation, G1, permits convergence on a given grammar G, why is the primary linguistic data produced by G1 not adequate for convergence by the subsequent generation G2 on G? Okay. Now, of course, it's always possible for disaster to strike. The answer to this question is simple if the whole generation G1 is massacred in an invasion or by bubonic plague, or some other disaster befalls a speech community such as import tariffs or something like that. So then there will be, a dramatic change. But in the normal course of events, take, for example, a situation like 16th century England, where this didn't happen, but we know that the English of the 16th century underwent some important changes, which I'll touch on later. This question then holds. And this is the logical problem of language change. Well, there's an answer to it, which refers to evaluation metrics. The evaluation metric makes G prime not equal to G, the innovative grammar, more accessible to the second generation G2 than G. Okay, that's sort of but then how and why, right? But that's the basic answer. And this is the connection between evaluation metrics and the study of language change. And Lightfoot, I think, actually made this connection in his pioneering work in 1979 in the form of the transparency principle, which many of you may remember. Lightfoot's essential idea was that a change takes place in a grammar when the older grammar, the conservative grammar G, became too opaque in some sense in relation to the more accessible innovative grammar G prime. Opacity could be due to various things. The accumulation of exception features on rules, derivational complexity, distance from surface forms. Lightfoot discusses several cases of this kind, slightly differing kinds, in that monograph, which was really the pioneering work in generative diachronic syntax, from which all the other work by myself and many others really essentially flows. But the thing is that here I think that the notion of evaluation metric is present. The transparency principle, which unfortunately was never actually formalized, it was left somewhat intuitive, either is an evaluation metric or directly derives from one in some way. So this notion of opacity is basically suboptimal grammar. So the conservative grammar G at some point becomes suboptimal in relation to grammar G prime. Okay. And in subsequent work with various people and others as well, I think this central idea has been developed, or at least there have been attempts to develop it. In the paper with Robin Clark that I just mentioned, we put forward something called the fitness metric, which actually stemmed from an earlier paper of Robin's, which was just about synchronic language acquisition. This was very precise, but very complex, and in fact, psychologically rather implausible. And then in the work I did with Anna Rusu on grammaticalization in the 2003 monograph, we put forward a simplicity metric, which, as it suggests, was simpler than the fitness metric, and was essentially was in fact a feature counting metric, which was an attempt then to be an evaluation metric for what one can think of as two competing grammars for a generation of acquirers, such that they converge on a grammar which is innovative in relation to the one underlying the experience they're exposed to. In this connection, I think the recent work by Charles Yang on the tolerance principle is extremely relevant and important, and in fact may really be a game changer. Here's the tolerance principle as put forward in Yang's 2016 monograph. So let R be a rule applicable to n items, of which E are exceptions. R is productive if and only if E is equal to or less than theta n, where theta n is n over the natural logarithm of n. Okay? I won't go into specific examples of this. There's a very good discussion of many examples of this in the 2016 monograph. It relates to the principal interest is as grammars change and develop during the course of language acquisition, but Yang does point out that it's relevant for diachronic change as well, and I think that's absolutely true. So one can think of it in these terms. In diachrony, the tolerance principle defines a tipping point beyond which exceptions to a productive rule R become intolerable. There are too many of them, and hence require the system to change so that R is no longer productive and may indeed disappear completely from the grammar. In other words, it values G prime without productive R more highly than G with productive R, taking G prime still to be the innovative grammar and G the conservative grammar. And in fact, Yang says morphological change must be driven by the numerical relationship between N and E, between the number of candidates for a rule and the number of exceptions to the rule for any given rule R. For example, tolerance can define the threshold for analogical leveling of morphological classes, a very common type of change. It lends itself very naturally to the description of cases of that kind. I think actually that it's possible to for the tolerance principle to be an implementation of Lightfoot's old intuition behind the transparency principle. Remember, Lightfoot said that one of the prime cases of opacity, so where the transparency principle forces a change, forces a grammar to be reanalyzed and replaced by a new one, is the case where there are too many exceptions. So that is exactly the tolerance principle. And in fact, it could give us a solution to the logical problem of language change as we just defined it, because we could think, well, basically, what differs between the primary linguistic data that given generations might be exposed to could be nothing more than random fluctuations in the lexicon, changing the values of both N and E. Okay. And so therefore changing the patterns of productivity in the rule system. As Yang goes on to say, the tolerance principle offers a concrete program that integrates language acquisition and change as originally envisaged in early work in generative phonology by Maurice Halley. Again, work which fed into sound pattern of English. So again, we see how notions of evaluation metric are sort of a common thread running through all of this. Okay, so now let's move back to synchronic discussion and principles and parameters theory. And here I want to look a little bit at the introduction to Lectures on Government and Binding, which is about 16 pages long and a really excellent summary of the significance of the proposals that were made in that book and the extent to which it was a continuation of earlier work and a break with earlier work. It's essentially all focusing on the notion and the explanatory value of the notion of parameter of universal grammar. So Chomsky says there, in a highly idealized picture of language acquisition, UG is taken to be a characterization of the child's pre-linguistic initial state. Experience, in part a construct based on internal state given or already attained, serves to fix the parameters of UG, providing a core grammar, guided perhaps by a structure of preferences and implicational relations among the parameters of core theory. If so, then considerations of markedness enter into the theory of core grammar. So markedness can regulate which systems are preferred, i.e., perhaps function as an evaluation metric, but no independent metric is needed or mentioned. Okay, and the notion of markedness can be seen as partially independent of evaluation metrics, which is the case actually in the system put forward in chapter 9 of the Sound Pattern of English. Chomsky goes on, if these assumptions, essentially the familiar assumptions about principles and parameters, are correct, then UG will make available only a finite class of possible core grammars in principle. And this was the first time that that notion came up. Previously, it had always been thought that UG made available an infinite class of grammars, among which the acquirer and the linguist had to choose. The acquirer, obviously, in constructing its own mental grammar. That is, UG will provide a finite set of parameters, each with a finite number of values, apart from the trivial matter of the morpheme or word list, which must be learned by direct exposure for the most part. Depending on the nature of the theory of markedness, there may or may not be an infinite class of possible grammars, but this is an essentially uninteresting question in this connection, since marked constructions will be added by direct evidence. So the key point is that from the point of view of language acquisition, the child is not having to choose and evaluate among an infinite set of grammars. So it seems, although this was not explicitly stated, but various people around that time, including, I can say, both myself and I had a conversation with David Lightfoot about this at the LSA Summer Institute at UCLA in 1983. And we both said, well, with principles and parameters, we don't need an evaluation metric. Whether Chomsky ever thought that, I'm not sure, but the introduction to Lectures on Government and Binding certainly very much plays down the notion of evaluation metric. This is discussed in a very nice overview of learnability theory in general by Janet Fodor and William Sakas in the Handbook of Universal Grammar that I edited for OUP in 2017. And so they point out what appeared certainly initially to be the advantages of principles and parameters theory in the early days, and certainly the advantage over the standard theory and extended standard theory models. So they say for n independent binary parameters, there would be 2 to the n distinct grammars for the learner to choose between, but at most n observations to be made. Each such fact would be simple and readily detectable in the input available to the learner. Once set, a parameter value could have far-reaching and complex consequences, so the learner's observation would not constitute evidence in the traditional sense. Rather, it functions just as a trigger that causes the value to be adopted by the learner. The triggering of parameters was viewed as more or less automatic, effortless, and instantaneous. So there was this clear idea, which is there in the introduction to LGB, and which was certainly the way people saw things, I think, in the early to mid 80s, at least, from what I could pick up as a graduate student in those days. And that is that the notion of parameter setting seemed to really give us a completely new and really explanatory handle on language acquisition for the first time, and seemed to be a real breakthrough in relation to what had gone before. And remember, what had gone before was the selection of the most highly valued grammar amongst an infinite set of grammars based on an evaluation metric. Again, in work with Robin Clark, we introduced this notion of parameter expression. And again, in fact, the term is due to Robin and is clearly modeled on the notion of gene expression in genetics, because we used a genetic algorithm as part of the fitness metric. But anyway, so we had this notion of parameter expression, which in itself I think is quite useful. So we said, this is not exactly the definition we had in the paper. This is a slight modification. A substring of the input text S expresses a parameter pi, just in case a grammar must have pi set to a definite value in order to assign a well-formed representation to S. So if we take a simple English sentence like, who did you see? Arguably we could say, well, in order for that sentence to get a well-formed representation, you have to have WH movement, you have to have subject aux inversion, and you do support and various other things, but at least that. those. So we could say this a sentence like this expresses the positive value of the WH movement parameter, and arguably expresses the positive value of whatever T to C parameter is involved in English subject aux inversion. And we could then give a definition of trigger, as here. A substring of the input text S is a trigger for parameter pi if S expresses pi. And we applied this notion actually to accounting for certain changes in the history of French in that paper, which I won't go into here. In earlier work, which our paper stemmed from fairly directly, Robin Clark had already identified that the notion of trigger is not straightforward, in that there can be ambiguous triggers of various kinds. So here's an example that he talked about. Take what looks like exceptional case marking. Gunnar believes Verdi to be smart. Well, in actual fact, this could be one of two different phenomena. It could be exceptional case marking of the English kind, which is perhaps our first thought given the sentences in English, but it could be what we can call structural case marking in a non-finite domain, which is what we know to exist in languages such as Irish and Latin, and probably other languages. So the string on its own doesn't tell you which of those two rather different phenomena it is. The phenomena differ because in the case of ECM, the subject of the infinitive is case licensed from outside, whereas outside the bracketed constituent there, whatever that is. And in the case of structural case marking, it's case licensed from inside. Now we could say, well, if you look at an example with a well-formed reflexive anaphor in the subject position, that tells us that we have a single binding domain here, since the example is well-formed. Gunnar believes himself to be smart. And so that favors an ECM type analysis. But as Robin Clark pointed out, not necessarily. Because what if we had a structural case marking system, so the bracketed constituent is a separate binding domain from the main clause, but the reflexive is well formed because the system has long distance anaphora. Okay, so 2 is not decisive. The point that Robin Clark wanted to make here is that different parameter settings have to be compared on a whole grammar basis. The individual examples are not sufficient to determine what kind of system we have, and so we need some kind of evaluation metric. Which is the better system for describing these data? And this led Robin to put forward the fitness metric in that 92 paper, which then we applied in the 93 paper to language change. To give a sense of the prevalence of parametric ambiguity of one kind or another, just take a very simple sentence like John walks. Okay, and now look at its French counterpart, Jean marche, its Italian counterpart, Gianni cammina, its German counterpart, Johann geht. Looks like, well, it is the same string, subject, verb, in each case, but we know that the structures are different in all 4 cases, which reflect differing parameter values for at least 3, if not 4, significant parameters in each language. So the parameters concern verb movement, the null subject parameter, some kind of EPP parameter requiring something in spec TP, and verb second. So in English, the sentence John walks does not feature verb movement. English is a non-null subject language, and we have an EPP requirement. French, in French, we have verb movement. The verb is in a different position in 4 to 3. Again, it's not a null subject language, and we have an EPP requirement. In Italian, there's probably also verb movement of pretty much the same kind as in French, but of course we would have the option of a null subject if the subject was a pronoun, and there's arguably no EPP effect. In German, on at least one fairly well widely adopted analysis of German, there is some controversy here, which those of you who know about German syntax, especially if you are a German syntactician, know about, but let me just gloss over that. One analysis of 6 would be that Johann is in spec CP and the verb is in C. It's a verb second sentence. So this illustrates that strings don't necessarily tell us very much about parameter settings. And in fact, in the paper with Robin, we identified 2 notions of what we call P ambiguity. as follows. A substring of the input text S is strongly p-ambiguous with respect to a parameter pi, just in case a grammar can have pi set to either value, assuming that it's binary, and assign a well-formed representation to S. A strongly p-ambiguous string may express either value of pi and therefore trigger either value of pi. A weakly p-ambiguous string expresses neither value of pi and therefore triggers neither value of pi. Those two notions of strong and weak p-ambiguity are actually quite hard to tease apart. They're obviously very important for language change, but I won't dwell on that here. Just stick to the synchronic issue of how acquirers can set parameters on the basis of triggers. So again, let's go back to our English sentence. John walks. Why is that not something like the structure in 4, which is what some people would say could be the analysis of Gianni Camina or a comparable sentence in some other null subject language? In other words, with the subject in some left dislocated position and a little pro subject of in spec TP, sorry. And why not the verb in T, as in French, and of course, as in pre-1600 English? Or why not John in spec CP and the verb in C, as in German, and in probably something like pre-1400 English? So it's important actually to see that the structures which are not the right ones for modern English, 5 and 6, were at one stage the right ones for English. And this very same string has actually undergone reanalysis, so the relevant parameters have changed their values. What we could say then is that all the sentence 3 and its counterparts in the other languages are all weakly p-ambiguous in relation to v to t, v to c, verb second, the EPP parameter, and the null subject parameter. We see the prevalence of p-ambiguity in the data and the importance of isolating triggers, which becomes very tricky, actually. And so what this shows us is that the very mechanical, automatic notion of parameter setting that was widely held to hold in the early days of principles and parameter theory, at least, doesn't really hold up. And so the notion that maybe the need for an evaluation metric was obviated by the principles and parameters theory doesn't seem to be true. We need to go back to some system of whole grammar or whole parameter system evaluations. Okay. In other words, we need a structure of preferences, to quote Chomsky from the introduction to LGB, in the parametric system. And Clark put that forward in his fitness metric. It was a way of describing which of two grammars, or deciding, I should say, which of two grammars was more highly valued given external criteria of adequacy, to quote LSLT. And of course, it's also clear, thinking of Chomsky's comments in the introduction to LGB, that the parametric system shows implicational relations. This becomes immediately obvious once we start thinking about how parameters might interact. And of course, empirically, the observations, for example, regarding word order that have been made in the Greenbergian typological tradition show us that implicational universals are real and therefore need to be accounted for. And this naturally leads this notion that there are rich implicational relations among parameters and that there's a kind of structure of preferences in the parameter system naturally leads to the idea that parameters could be hierarchically organized. The idea of a parameter hierarchy was first put forward by Mark Baker in his 2001 book, The Atoms of Language. But this leads us naturally to the proposals that we had in the Rethinking Comparative Syntax project. That project was essentially inspired by Baker's ideas about hierarchies, but what we proposed, particularly myself in joint work with Anders Holmberg originally, proposed was that there were several different hierarchies for different phenomena. We also adopted the Barrère-Chomsky conjecture, the idea that all parameters of variation are attributable to differences in the features of particular items, functional heads in the lexicon, the formal features being things like case, number, person, gender, and so on. And we also took seriously Chomsky's ideas of the three factors in language design. So the first factor is universal grammar, and we took it that basically UG basically leaves certain functional heads underspecified for certain features. The second factor is experience. Clearly, that's again triggers expressing parameter values. Um, and the third factors would be general strategies of first language acquisition based on computational conservatism. And this is effectively the evaluation metric again. Okay. Um, and we proposed in the RECOS system two types of third factors: feature economy, which originated in, well, not just work with Russo, but also earlier work with Robin Clark, and then what I called input generalization in my 2007 monograph. And another example of a third factor would arguably be the subset principle, and there are others. Here's an example of the basic form of a parameter hierarchy. I'll go over this fairly quickly because I think time is passing. So the basic idea would be, is a given formal feature present in the system? That's the first option. If not, then that's that. The hierarchy sort of stops. If the feature is detected, then the next question is the feature present on all heads or all relevant heads defined in some way? And if that's not the case, then essentially we move to subsets of heads, where maybe new features are introduced in order to further refine the set of heads or the subsets of heads which the feature is associated with. And we in the early work with Holmberg and subsequent work, we refer to this as the know all sum approach. So first you assume something isn't there, then you assume it's everywhere, then you assume it's somewhere, where somewhere becomes more and more narrowly defined. So as we move down the hierarchies, the systems become more marked, the parameters become intrinsically more complex, having a longer description. They're further along a learning path, arguably, and are diachronically more unstable. So these predictions were all made by the system, so they're quite strong predictions. And again, we won't go into the empirical side of this here. Here's an example of a specific parameter. This one is for word order. So is L some linearization feature which determines, let's say, head final order present? If not, then the system is completely head initial. If it is and it's present on all heads, then we have a harmonically head final system. If it's only present on some subset of heads, for example, plus or minus V, then we have a consistently head final clause or consistently head final nominal, but head initial in the other domain. And then there are various ways in which it can be further narrowed down. I'll skip over these. This is just another example of a parameter hierarchy that was put forward by Michelle Sheehan for alignment. But since we don't have time to go into that in detail, I'll leave it. You can look at Michelle's 2017 paper for the details. So moving on, so that system, the RECOS system, relied on two notions, crucially. One was input generalization alongside feature economy as a third factor participating in an evaluation metric, and the other was the Barrère-Chomsky conjecture. And what I want to do in the remainder of the talk is to suggest that both of those ideas should be revised. Input generalization should be completely eliminated, and the Barrère-Chomsky conjecture should be refined. So let me try and cover both of these points in the remaining time. Actually, Lydia and Kleanthes, how much time do I have left? I didn't check when we started.
I would say maybe 15, 20 minutes.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's good. Okay, thank you. Thanks. Okay, so in the context of the RECOS approach, the rethinking comparative syntax approach, input generalization played a very important role. It allowed acquirers to make the abductive leap from the presence of a formal feature in one context to the presence of that feature in all possible or relevant contexts. For example, harmonic head final word order, which we just saw a hierarchy for. So assuming for concreteness, an anti-symmetric approach to linearization a la Kane, we can think that the presence of a given feature on a given head, just call the feature F. It was L in the hierarchy a little while ago, but let's call the feature F. Basically, that feature triggers movement of a complement to a specifier position. So it will basically give us surface head final order in line with the linear correspondence axiom. So where this F is a diacritic feature of X triggering rollup, then the preference for harmonic head final orders follows from the generalization of that diacritic to all relevant heads. Okay, so input generalization plays a very important role. It essentially gives us an account of word order harmony. The absence of the feature, of course, gives you a head initial system. The presence of the feature, given input generalization and the preference for it to generalize, will mean that harmonic head final orders are preferred over various kinds of disharmonic orders. And that, of course, is in line with the empirical discoveries in the Greenbergian tradition. Essentially, input generalization requires exposure to a single instance of head final order for that order to be assumed by the acquirer for all relevant heads. I've just said this, really. And it combines with feature economy to form parameter hierarchies. In the case of word order, feature economy, FE, prefers the absence of the feature, and that will give rise to harmonic head initiality. So the preferred option is head initial. The next preferred option is fully head final, because once you posit the feature, you generalize the feature. Disharmonic orders are dispreferred because they arise from restricted application of input generalization forced by the primary linguistic data, but dispreferred by input generalization. Now, that's the basic outline of how the system worked in the RECOS approach. What I want to propose is actually that input generalization is not required as a third factor. Feature economy is sufficient. And actually, this then lines up with the tradition of characterizing evaluation metrics going all the way back to morphophonemics of modern Hebrew in terms of length. So to establish this, I'll look briefly now at parameters regulating word order. In work in progress, sort of, I also look at null arguments and verb movement in the same light, but there's no time to go into all of that here. So let's just look at word order. So basically the question is, if harmonic head final orders involve features and operations that head initial languages lack, or even if we looked at it the other way around, why should they, either or both of them, be more cross-linguistically common than disharmonic systems? In other words, why does cross-categorial harmony, in Jack Hawkins's sense, defined here from his 1983 book, hold? Okay, so why is there this clear preference for cross-categorial harmony? Well, in a fully harmonic head final system without input generalization, how would we look at this? Well, again, assuming an antisymmetric approach to linearization, a fully harmonic system in which all complements precede their heads in surface order has a roll-up rule that we can just write as this. Okay. So when you have XYP goes to YP, maybe some other material X. So I'm not committing to YP here being in the specifier of XP, although it might be. No further specification of either head or complement is required since the operation is fully general. Okay. Now, what about a system where clauses but not nominals are fully head final? A kind of system we find a lot, actually. If all functional categories in the clause have a V feature, while those in the nominal have an N feature, we could think of this as a way of defining the extended projection of the verb and the noun, respectively, in Grimshaw's sense, just in featural terms. Then the roll-up rule for a language where you have head final clauses would be 5. Okay, so X has to be specified plus V. The structural description of 5 is clearly more complex than the one in 4. In feature counting terms, it involves one more feature. Okay. So by feature economy alone, 5 is more complex than 4 and therefore dispreferred. This may actually be what we find in a language like Japanese, because if one looks at the internal structure of DPs in Japanese, the basic order seems to be demonstrative numeral classifier noun. Andrew Simpson has a paper in NLLT from 2022 on this. So if we assume a structure like 6 for the nominal, then in an order like the one seen in 7, where you can see in the boldface nominal, leaving aside the case particle, we have the order demonstrative, numeral, classifier, and then noun. Okay. Simpson argues that the case particles are inserted at PF. So there's no roll-up here, basically. Taking the classifier to be perhaps little n. Whereas, of course, we have roll-up in the clause, as shown by example 8. I'm sorry I didn't subscript CP and TP there. But this is a familiar example of head final order in the clause, notably in that we have the order object, verb, tense, complementizer. So the rule in 5, which says that roll-up applies around plus V heads, and taking all clausal heads, including C, to be plus V, correctly characterizes Japanese word order. Now, if we look at German, of course, what we see is a very well-known fact that complementizers are initial, but that once we extrapolate away from the confound of verb second, VP and TP are head final. So roll-up applies in the clause as far as TP, but not at CP, since C precedes TP. So this is a case of disharmony within the clause. This can be captured by a rule like 10. So we say where X has the feature plus V, so it's a clausal head, but minus discourse, meaning it's not a head in the discourse domain. So it's not a head in the left periphery. It's not C or any head in a potentially split left periphery. So in other words, roll-up applies everywhere up to the left periphery. It's that particular kind of disharmonic system. So this rule specifies that, yeah, that's what I just said, roll-up applies in all domains of the clause except the discourse domain CP. There are various West African languages which seem to show AUX-OV order under various conditions. Nupe is an example as described by Kandibowicz and Baker in a paper from 2003. We can see that here in 11, where we have the order subject, perfective marker, object, verb. So roll-up here is arguably confined to little vp. So here we could say that roll-up applies where X is verbal, so it's a clausal head, but it's not the left periphery, minus discourse, and it's not a head in the inflectional system, the extended TP, so minus infl. So rule 12 states that roll-up applies in all domains of the clause except the inflectional and discourse domains, i.e. only within the thematic domain, the VP shells. So it gives us AUX-OV order fairly systematically. And what we can see is that the rule in 12, that's this one, has more features than the rule in 4, 5, or 10. In fact, each of the rules 4, 5, 10, 12 is slightly more complex than the previous one. So the more disharmonic the system, the more complex the structural description for roll-up in feature terms. The more harmonic systems have simpler structural descriptions for roll-up, and so they are relatively less complex, and we correctly expect them to be cross-linguistically more frequent. Fully head initial systems lack any roll-up operations at all, and in this sense are simpler than head final systems of any kind. And in fact, there is reason to think that head initial order is less marked than head final order. They're more frequent. They're not subject to various kinds of constraints. The Grohmann database, which came out 2 years ago, clearly shows that VO orders are more frequent than OV. So most importantly, then, we see that feature economy does all the work in determining complexity. There's simply no need for input generalization. And in fact, the feature count, the evaluation metric is simple feature counting. It's very close in spirit to the one in the sound pattern of English. So hence we don't need input generalization. So that's a little demonstration in the domain of word order. So now let's move on to the Barrère-Chomsky conjecture. As I said, this is the other aspect of the rethinking comparative syntax approach, which was assumed then, and which I now think needs not rejecting, but refining. And here, here actually this next section is based on joint work that I'm currently doing with Dalina Kaluli, and in fact we'll be presenting it at the upcoming CGG conference in Madrid next month. So anyway, the issue here is, in connection with the Boyer-Chomsky conjecture, the problem of formal features. So here's the Boyer-Chomsky conjecture again. All parameters of variation are attributable to differences in formal features of the functional heads in the lexicon. But what are these features? Well, okay, when you ask anyone, including me, you get an answer like 13. Well, phi features, case features, categorical features, EPP features, WH features, D features, and so on. And so on what? Okay. Basically, this is at best an incomplete extensional definition. It's a partial list. And we don't know why the list is the way it is. In other words, we don't have an intentional definition. An intentional definition ought to look something like 14. F is a formal feature of UG if and only if P. But what is the content of P? We don't have an answer to that question, or at least I'm not aware of one. And that is a pretty serious problem for the theory as it currently stands, certainly for the Boyer-Chomsky conjecture as the center of the account of cross-linguistic variation. In fact, arguably, the Boyer-Chomsky conjecture as it stands is undermined, because without a definition like 14, no predictions can really be made about limits to variation across grammars. Or to put it in the terminology of morphophonemics of modern Hebrew, we don't have a clear constant notation. We saw this problem with the extensional list in 13 on the previous slide. And of course, it's clear that phi features and case features, for example, relate to the content of inflectional systems in very many languages and do seem to form a clear axis of variation. There's no doubt about that. But the problem is that the Boyer-Chomsky conjecture doesn't restrict variation to those features. There doesn't seem to be any principled way to do it. And it doesn't present the postulation of features like EPP features, which everyone knows are just rather unsatisfactory. And so in actual fact, the list in 13 is hardly a natural class. And it could be worse. What prevents us from postulating a feature like plus minus n-ary merge? Okay. So we could say that's a feature that you can associate with a functional head. A positive value for that feature would allow multiple merge to a single functional head, creating essentially a flat structure, coming close to what used to be called W-star languages or non-configurational languages in the sense of Hale and Chomsky 81, who's following on from Hale. So this, you could say, yeah, well, you need that for the non-configurational parameter, non-configurationality parameter. But these days, I take it that non-configurational languages have been basically shown not to really exist. And so we don't want a parameter of this kind. And of course, parameterizing merge seems to be highly undesirable conceptually. But the BCC, the Boyer-Chomsky conjecture, doesn't on the face of it prevent that. There's nothing in our theory of features which prevents the postulation of a feature like 15. And that's bad, okay? So this is where Dalina Kaluli and I have a proposal to make, which is 16, that parametric variation arises from the interaction of redundancy and deficiency of formal features of functional heads. The definitions of redundancy and deficiency are taken from the work by the special research group based in Austria, Onea et al. These are the definitions. I don't want to insist too much on these two definitions, but at least what we can see is that these definitions have the merit of precision. And the notions of redundancy and redundancy and deficiency have a certain clear sort of content. Okay, so adopting this idea, the idea in 16 that it's redundancy and deficiency of formal features that determines variation, has two immediate positive consequences. First, whatever merge is, it is neither redundant nor deficient. That seems very clear. So it can't be parameterized. And that's the result we want. So a feature like that one in 15 plus minus n-ary merge can't be postulated in this system. Second, we can think that lexical categories are neither redundant nor deficient by their nature. That seems intuitively very plausible. And so we can immediately understand why parametric variation is limited to functional categories, which is actually stipulated by the Breyer-Chomsky conjecture, right? So we get two really good results straight away. A third result has to do with agree. Here's a particular formulation of agree. Again, we don't have to linger too much over the details, but if we think of formal features as attribute value pairs like person 3 or gender M, case nominative, and so on, then we could think of unvalued features as essentially lacking, well, a value and therefore uninterpretable at the relevant interfaces. And then agree we could think as an operation which copies the value from the goal to the probe. So the goal has a interpretable features, i.e. valued. So there's a value in the value slot, and that is copied to the probe. So that's a way of thinking about agree. And in these terms, we can think, well, once you make the copy, you clearly have redundancy. When you have an unvalued feature, you have deficiency. So both redundancy and deficiency are related to agree. And of course, we know that agree and the formal features it operates on are a very major locus of parametric variation. So the approach based on redundancy and deficiency predicts this. Arguably, the Breyer-Chomsky conjecture predicts this too in its standard form, but we think that our approach makes that prediction clearer and finer. Many parameters concern phi features and case features, also tense features, clause typing features such as WHQ and so on. And these are all cases, examples where we have agree. So our conjecture then is that F is a formal feature of UG if and only if F is redundant. Actually, that should be and or deficient. So all parameters of variation are attributable to redundancy and or deficiency of formal features of the functional heads in the lexicon. This is the intentional definition of formal features, or of the formal features that are relevant to parametric variation. So we think this is an important and very promising refinement of the Breyer-Chomsky conjecture. Okay, so to conclude, on input generalization, well, it's not needed, so need not, should not, does not exist. And so approaches which generalize over feature economy and input generalization are essentially misguided because it's generalizing over feature economy and nothing. And so feature economy basically comes out as the evaluation metric, a conclusion which has precedence going way back to the very beginning of generative grammar. The shorter grammar has the fewest features, and we saw in the first part of the presentation that that notion goes all the way back to morphophonemics of modern Hebrew and recurs as a thread through LSLT, syntactic structures, aspects, and sound pattern of English. There's an obvious link here, as various people, notably Bob Berwick and others, have pointed out to the notion of minimal description length in computer science. And Goldsmith actually discusses this in that paper I began with. So I won't go into that here, but there's a clear connection which makes the idea all the more sort of plausible as a third factor. So again, if we see feature economy as the evaluation metric, we can go right back to a quotation I gave at the beginning. Given the fixed notation, so this is from Morphophonemics of Modern Hebrew again. Given the fixed notation, the criteria of simplicity governing the ordering of statements are as follows: that the shorter grammar is the simpler, and that among equally short grammars, the simplest is that in which the average length of derivation of sentences is least. So the fixed notation for us would be merge, lexical categories, and a pool of formal features, plus some operation like agree, perhaps also notions of phase and so on, which I haven't mentioned. Grammars vary in their formal features, making a one-time selection, as Chomsky put forward in Derivation by Phase. And formal features are intentionally defined in terms of redundancy and deficiency, as we've just seen. So the approach that I'm sketching here, eliminating input generalization and refining the Breyer-Chomsky conjecture in the way that I've just described based on the joint work with Dalina Kaluli, makes good on the initial proposals in early generative grammar. And in fact, the evaluation metric and the fixed notation interact to determine the nature of linguistic structure, as Chomsky put forward in syntactic structures. And so we're essentially still pursuing that program. We know more about more languages. We have a much more refined theory of grammar. We have a notion of parameter, which seems useful, but the basic project is still the same, and that's what we're following on. And I think I can leave it there. So thank you.
Wonderful, great. Thank you very much. Okay, so the floor is open for discussion. We're inviting feedback, questions, comments from anybody. But in our tradition, we would like to start with early career researchers, students, postdocs, or eager beavers like Dimitri. Go ahead.
Did you see me raising my hand?
Yes.
Great. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Ian. Thanks very much for this and very nice to see you. So you're basically proposing to replace parameters with generalized movement rules of some sort. And well, that's not my question exactly. So I thought that somehow FOFC, the final condition, followed from some interpretation of input generalization, the fact that you can spread a feature downwards and you don't skip ahead. And I was thinking that, okay, you have this way to say that grammars like NUPE word order are marked because you have three features there. What if you had something restricting this roll-up movement to plus infil? Wouldn't that produce a FOFC violating language? Yeah, I mean, it would only apply to T and not V in a way, and you would get a FOFC violation of some sort.
Mm-hmm. Yes, on the face of it, that might be true. I should just clarify one thing. It's not an attempt to reduce all parameters to movement rules. Word order parameters
Okay.
are reduced to movement rules, but that really follows from the adoption of the anti-symmetric approach. So head final orders have to be derived, and so the incidence of head final orders follows from the incidence of movement rules. Concerning your specific question, yeah, well, one has to, I think, postulate FOFC as a separate condition
Okay.
On basically roll-up movement, and the condition has to be that roll-up movement must always apply first in the minimal domain.
Mm.
And so then you can't have a rule which requires it to apply only in the infill domain. I think that's basically the way to look at it, and I think that's actually quite an interesting way of looking at it. I should add that I haven't been able to convince Anders Holmberg of this, but that's my
Okay.
view. So, um,
Thank you.
Okay, again, graduate students, undergraduate students, postdocs, any early career researchers, don't be shy. You don't need to wait for the old guys to ask questions, but if you want to get a cue, let's get with Charles, please.
Can you hear me?
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, I just had a couple of, I don't know if I'm the token phonologist here, but a couple of points from phonology. The discussion of P ambiguity led you to conclude that we need something like what I think computer scientists call batch learning, right? You can't just update your grammar on the basis of each form you get. And it's really obvious that this is true in phonology, because if you have something, any kind of neutralization process, like, you have radus, you don't know and they're morphologically related, you don't know if there's final devoicing or if there's T to D between vowels. And so you have to get evidence, like if you're learning German, when you see that there's also ratus, then you know that there's final devoicing. So it's really easy to show this in the phonological world, right? That you can't just and so that's one interesting thing. And then coming to the MDL discussion, the minimum description length discussion, and the idea of feature economy. Kyle Gorman and I have been working on this, building on the work that Mark Hale and I did on the subset principle. But there's a really simple fact that shows that MDL is going to not work in phonology, which is that it doesn't guarantee uniqueness. You might have a language where you've got an extensionally a set of vowels that you could define intentionally as being plus back or plus round, and either grammar is going to work. And so MDL might not lead you to a unique solution. And for that and for various other reasons, we actually take the position that the best grammar from an acquisition perspective is actually the one that's as rich as possible. And so we go for the opposite. We end up in the opposite direction of MDL. So just something from phonology that might make a good comparison or contrast.
Yeah, okay, thanks. That's very interesting, actually. I mean, definitely your first point, yeah, I think is, I tried to sort of effectively illustrate that with those simple example, John walks and its counterparts in familiar languages. Yeah, your second point is very interesting. I think you might have noticed that I actually think that in syntax we can still learn quite a bit from phonology. And certainly when it comes to the notion of evaluation metrics, I've always felt that the proposals in the later chapters of SPE were very inspiring and should be a model for everyone. I don't know if you would fully agree with that. You probably know much more about it than I do. But in any case, the general point is well taken, and I'd be very interested actually in what leads you to the conclusion that something as simple as minimal description length or an economy defined in those terms is not going to be enough. That's it would be interesting to see if we can find clear syntactic analogs to that conclusion, or whether it turns out the syntax is different. Either way, it would be interesting.
Thanks.
So,
I'll be in touch.
thanks. Yeah.
Okay, Robert and Howard, I can see you, and now also Adam, but we have a bona fide early career researcher. Keith, please go ahead. Keith? Did you disappear?
He's muted.
Oh, you just disappeared. Okay. Yeah, Howard, go ahead. You were first.
Sorry, I'm not here. If that's okay.
Oh, Keith, hi.
Okay, no, sorry, yeah. Yeah, so thank you very much. I think that was absolutely terrific. Yeah, I mean, you've given us many definitions of simplicity metric, etc. Yeah, I'm wondering whether we could sort of tie all of this in more with Chomsky's definitions, because Chomsky in GB, PNP, and MP has given different definitions. So, for example, in early MP, where he says that move is more complex than merge, so move should be preempted wherever possible. In POP, POP, he revises that. He says that internal merge and external merge are not more complex than one another, etc. I don't think I saw that many references to Chomsky's definitions of simplicity. So I'm wondering whether we could tie your many definitions of evaluation metrics and feature economy with Chomsky's, and see whether we can put all of these together, and whether we can find unified consensus between you, your many colleagues, and Chomsky.
Well, actually, I think most of the definitions I gave, especially at the beginning, were based on early work by Chomsky, long pre-minimalist program. But I think I didn't really say much about the nature of the minimalist program in relation to those issues directly, because I switched the discussion more towards parameters in relation to evaluation metrics in the whole discussion of everything from lectures on government and binding onwards. I think there's a way in which one can see the minimalist program as very directly executing the early program as it's articulated in, say, LSLT, by basically essentially saying that the evaluation metric is kind of built into the system in some sense, and so it automatically determines optimization of all processes. And I think this is something which I think is an intuition behind the minimalist program, and which could and should perhaps be made clearer. But I think this is one way to look at it. That the distinction that was made early on between the notation and the evaluation of the grammars written in the notation with the minimalist program seems to collapse. into basically the notation is automatically, in some sense, self-evaluating. I think that's perhaps one way to think about minimalism, which is kind of helpful, I think. And that would then, I mean, in that sense, most of what I've talked about will be unified. But then again, the issue of evaluation of grammars in relation to complexity, in relation to parameters, becomes a separate one from that. And we have to sort of figure that out.
Yeah,
But
sure. But just to I would like to sort of seek your opinion. And nowadays no one believes that move is more complex than merge anymore. So internal merge is not necessarily more complex than external merge. And so both can perfectly coexist. Yeah, and so how would we or Chomsky try to redefine simplicity? I mean, I'm just that's a very general question, but I'm just wondering in light of what you've shown us today, what more can we say about simplicity and Chomsky
you wouldn't
models?
necessarily need to refine your notion of simplicity if your concept of what move is changes, which is essentially what happened when move is reduced to internal merge. Then the way it interacts with the simplicity criterion changes at the same time. And in fact, Chomsky made that very clear when he first proposed internal merge. He said, all of a sudden, not only is it not a problem that we have movement, which in early minimalism it was thought of, it was seen as, but actually we expect it. So nothing changes in the notion of simplicity. What changed is how we organize the grammar, and clearly, and in fact, we optimize the grammar, right? So,
fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you. That was great.
Yeah, perhaps Keith, your question also relates to the early ideas of derivational economy versus methodological economy as early MP evaluation metrics. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Howard, Robert, Adam, and Memo, unless there's any early career researchers who would like to add in. Howard, please. Please
can't hear
unmute.
you.
Yes. We can't hear you. You're unmuted, but we can't hear you. No. It's an interface issue. Nah, doesn't work.
How about now?
Perfect.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. I thought I had the settings right. I wanted to thank you, Ian, for the very nice presentation. Two quick comments. One actually relates to something you said in response to Charles, and that's that often syntax has things to learn from phonology. Looking at the whole history of the field of syntax, I've always been struck by the fact that two of the most fundamental concepts in syntax, the principle of the cycle and the principle of distinctive features, were there in phonology generations before they were there in syntax. And I always wondered why it took so long for syntax to catch up. Another point I quickly wanted to make is I was struck by your early observation about the connection between the need for an evaluation metric and how many grammars. If there are an infinite number of grammars, you need some method of distinguishing them. And I've always been, from the time I was a student, there's something that confused me, and it still confuses me. The generative semanticists argued very strongly against the need for an evaluation metric. So you would think they would then say, well, there are way few grammars than Chomsky thought. But no, they argued that there are way more grammars than Chomsky thought. Chomsky at the time thought there were an infinite number, and somehow the generative semanticists thought that was too low a number. We need even more, but we still don't need an evaluation metric. That continues to confuse me 55 years later.
Okay, actually, that last point I was unaware of. That's very interesting from the point of view of the history of the field. Your first point, I totally agree with. I mean, if and again, SPE is a great example when you look at the cyclic account of English stress assignment and how it obeys a very strict notion of cycle, and how you also have the notion of bracketing erasure, which means you can't go back to anything, right?
Right.
And I mean, one can think of phase impenetrability in current theory as a form of bracketing erasure, essentially. So, you know, it's so there's a real similarity there, I think. Yeah, the second point, I'd be really grateful to have a reference on that because I was unaware of that fact about generative semantics. That's very interesting.
Okay,
So,
I'll try to find some things and send them to you. Unfortunately, when I retired, I had to abandon about 95% of my files and books. So I don't know if I can still put my hands on anything, but I'll try.
Okay, thanks. That's great. Thank you.
Okay, Robert May, please.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. That was a very, very interesting talk. Particularly, I appreciate you're trying to isolate out the ideas that give continuity to the field. I think it's extremely important. And I think part of the whole idea of this whole series was to try and get to ideas like that. What were the ideas that really give coherence to this as an undertaking over 75 years? And what are the ideas and how are they reflected in contemporary thinking? So I really appreciated your talk. Before I make my point, though, I just want to ask Howard a question, which is exactly what sense of more infinite did they have in mind? Is it like, you know, more natural numbers and even numbers? I mean, I don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah, don't know. I mean, they didn't put it quite the way I just did, but they definitely said Chomsky imposed way too strict requirements on what could possibly be a grammar. So they obviously had in mind there are more grammars available than he thought.
Kind of continuum problem for grammars, but
yeah,
whatever.
Well, there's that. I think of that paper by co-authored by Postal about the vastness of natural languages, arguing that there's not even a countable number of languages.
Okay, so it's a transfinite number. Okay, fine. But all aside, Ian, I was very taken by a very brief comment you had from Chomsky from LSLT on your slides, page 119, where he mentions that these issues really are emerging, I believe, from philosophy of science. And I think it's interesting to ask what those questions are in philosophy of science. What was the concern? Yeah, you want to get to the slide.
That's the one, right?
Yes, that's the one, exactly. The simplicity of linguistic, oops. Where'd you go?
I don't know what happened then. Sorry.
Okay.
I was there a minute ago, and then yeah. Anyway, yeah, I know the slide you mean. I'll find it. There, that's the one.
Yes. Okay. So I think you know, what is that supposed to mean? You know, in Chomsky's mind when that was written. Okay. And what was the question within philosophy of science that was animating? And that was, you know, had to do with the nature of scientific knowledge. And we have this emerging, the dispute between Carnap and Quine, where Quine argues that the notions of meaning on which scientific knowledge and Carnap's work was based was not coherent. It was incoherent. That was the point of two dogmas of empiricism and the problem of knowledge in linguistics. The really key paper, and this is just meant as helpful to your project here, is the paper by Goodman called On the Simplicity of Ideas from 1953. And that's really the key paper. And I actually did talk to Chomsky about this, and he acknowledged this is where this whole idea of evaluation comes from. And there, what Goodman tries to argue is that you can get a notion of evaluation of formal systems by basically comparing exactly the things that you've been talking about, number of symbols, and that leading, with respect to notation, to a notion of depth of generalization. And so the system with the least, you know, the most compact system, which makes the most use of your notational conventions, is the one that expresses the deepest generalizations. And those are the ones which are to be preferred in the ordering of systems. And this comes directly from that paper of Goodman's. So you might want to just take a look at that, because I think that really is the intellectual milieu in which this is emerging. The idea that this is supposed to be a system of knowledge, that this is an epistemological problem Chomsky is facing, and that the approach is how do you get a system, a purely formal system, which is going to be used to characterize and express generalizations about language, to also constitute a system of knowledge, in particular scientific knowledge, and hence, as you pointed out, the relation between scientific and human knowledge, as you pointed out before, how are you going to characterize that in terms of being in a purely formal system? And this dispute has gone on, has had great legs within the philosophical discussion between whether you can actually get a coherent notion of knowledge of language, which Chomsky wants, based in a purely formal system, as opposed to a system which has to make an appeal to meaning, which of course Chomsky is rejecting in terms of the foundation of linguistics. I mean, that was part of the core foundational argument, he was doing critical argument he was giving to reject prior structural linguistics and their dependence on meaning to basically characterize the construction of grammars. So I think that the ideas that you mentioned are exactly the right ones and are really foundational to the enterprise. But it really, the only thing I would sort of urge you to emphasize a little more is this relationship to the emergence of these ideas to the notion of the characterization of knowledge of language.
Right, right. No, that's really helpful. Thanks, Robert. That's I mean, I've picked up on the references to Goodman in particular in LSLT, and I think maybe also Morphophonemics in Modern Hebrew, but definitely LSLT. You can see the connection just looking at the footnotes in LSLT,
Right,
actually.
right.
But what I thought was really nice about this quotation was, he's saying, okay, we can evaluate theories in one way or another, linguistic theories or any other kind of theory for that matter. But within linguistics, what we're interested in is evaluating grammars, and the evaluation of grammars is a different thing in the sense that it may be based on similar concepts, but it's a different enterprise. That's, I think, the thing.
Yeah,
And
sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, and just following up on what you said, I really think, having sort of gone back and read some of this early material, it really is a constant thread throughout the theory, which I think was lost sight of a little bit in the early 80s in the excitement that came with the notion with the breakthrough of principles and parameters. But then it did turn out quite quickly that we still needed some kind of notion of evaluation. And Chomsky, in the introduction to LGB, if you read it carefully, does hedge his bets a little bit, actually. It's kind of interesting. So,
yeah, no, I mean,
yeah.
I would only, having been there at the time, I would dispute a little bit that there was an awareness of these issues at the time of the emergence of LGB. It was just that, particularly, I personally think the other key paper here is on WH movement, where you really have this effort the real first empirical effort to try and reduce down to a finite set. And that the evaluation metric really takes on a different dimension when you're dealing over a finite domain than when you're dealing over an infinite domain. I think that's really a critical juncture. And I think WH movement in many ways represents the juncture point in his thinking about this in terms of actually trying to actualize it at the time. So I would emphasize that. But I do think that, really this is trying to understand the expressive capacity of this formal system, okay? And the nature of formal systems as being something which in and of itself inherently can characterize knowledge without recourse to meaning. I think that's really the key idea that's still with us today and still under dispute.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. No, that's great. That's really great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, if anybody's interested, Charles Rees just quoted a passage from Chomsky and Halley in the chat, not from SPE, but from a 1965 article. So please go ahead and read it for yourselves. In the meantime, we've got Adam Szepkowski, if you could.
Yes, hi, thanks. Very nice talk. Can you hear me?
Thanks. Yes.
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, okay. So I have two questions about the last part of your talk. If you don't mind, I'll ask both of them because they might be related. So I like the idea of intentional definition of formal features, but I on the basis of what's on the slides, I have trouble operationalizing this definition, right? How would I go about applying it? So in this context, there are some approaches that say, no, case does not exist. Case is really category, that's Pazetsky 2013, or, dependent case is really, double sets of 5 features, that's Clement Deal recent paper. So how could I go about convincing them that no, case is a formal feature on the basis of Ian Roberts' definition? So that's my first question. And
okay.
my second question is about merge, N-ary merge. So this recent paper by Ad Neleman and I think Chomsky himself in some recent co-author publication mentioned this possibility that coordination is really n-ary, right?
Yeah.
So, given that there might be possibility of two operations, binary merge and, general set merge, n-ary set merge, would this contradict what you said about, plus minus n-ary, or would it not, because that would be two different operations rather than matter of, a formal feature? So
Yeah.
these are my two questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. On the first one, I don't have a definition of case to. I was just assuming, pick your favorite notion of case as long as it's a formal feature, which it's or a set of formal features, which it's often held to be. It's true. Dependent case theory has another view. If you don't think there's any notion of abstract case, then fine. I mean, then it just falls outside of the picture. So I was just taking cases on a fairly standard view as something which might be thought of as readily parameterizable. If there is a notion of abstract case, I think it's reasonably clear that languages vary concerning abstract case. For example, following on from the Michelle Sheehan hierarchy that I briefly had up there, her essential idea, which various other people also have adopted, is that ergative case is a kind of inherent case assigned to external arguments under certain conditions. But I don't have any axe to grind as regards the notion of case. I was just taking that as an example of a formal feature. Then concerning the n-ary merge.
Sorry, if I may,
yeah.
I didn't ask for a definition of case, right? But assuming that, I was asking, for how to apply the intentional definition of formal features so that I could show that, case is a formal feature in this sense. How can I show that, assuming that something like case exists, it's deficient and or redundant? It's simply not clear to me how to apply your definitions.
I would say that, yeah, okay. I would take, again, what I think is a fairly standard view, that case features are deficient in the sense that they never have any kind of CI life. They're always, they just don't interface with this. They don't mean anything, to put it very simply. Okay. And I think certainly for structural case, that's true. Arguably for, inherent oblique case and so on, it's also true, I think. That would be how it fits in. On the n-ary merge question, the issue would be, okay, maybe there is n-ary merge in coordinate structures. I don't, okay, let's just assume that that's at least a possibility. The issue for what I was saying would be whether that could be parameterized. So whether you could imagine a language in which all syntactic relations were effectively coordination, right? Which seems highly implausible, I think. In which case, maybe coordination is a case where you don't have binary merge, but it would be then an aspect of the general theory of merge. You'd have two kinds of merge. One gives you subordination, one gives you coordination, but it's still invariant cross-linguistically. So, because it's neither deficient nor redundant. So, on the other hand, of course, one could have anti-symmetric theories of coordination that Kane and Alan Munn and various other people have put forward. So, yeah, I don't know.
Before we move to Memo, can I just butt in, because it relates to Adam's question, in a sense, do you still assume principles? So you talked a lot about parameters.
Right.
What about the principles? And is merge one of those principles part of UG?
I mean, not really. I mean, the old notion of principles and parameters essentially was, I think, left aside by the minimalist program. I mean, you could say merge is a principle, but it doesn't seem very plausible, really. It's just a core operation, right?
Right.
So no, I think what characterizes the minimalist program as in contrast to GB theory is that it doesn't really have any principles.
Right. Other
Minimalists
than
are
perhaps
unprincipled.
recursion, which could be, yeah.
Well, that's just merge,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. But
That's
so
just the output of merge.
if merge were a principle, you wouldn't have to worry about parameterizing it. But if merge is not a principle, then if it's just an operation, it should be parameterizable. That's what you say.
No, my view would be that as an invariant operation, which for which these
Because it's
notions of,
R&D, yes, sure.
yeah, for which these notions of redundancy and deficiency just don't apply. It's kind of sufficient unto itself, merge, right? Then it can't be parameterized.
Okay,
for that
thank you.
reason. Yeah.
Guglielmo Cinque, please. please unmute yourself.
Is this me? Can I talk?
Yes.
Okay, Ian, thank you for the beautiful talk that you gave.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have one question. I was wondering whether your and Alina's refinement of the Borel-Chomsky conjecture could be extended to parametric variation in the non-functional lexicon. In what I had in mind, if you take, for example, there are many cases, but let me cite one from the kinship terminology.
Mm-hmm.
In at least a couple of languages that I know, it must be marked, the same morpheme can cover grandparents and grandchildren. And as opposed to English or Italian, where you have different lexical items. But take also Italian nipote, which corresponds to grandchild and nephew, niece. And here I was wondering whether by decomposing features, in this case, it's, ascending, descending in lines starting from ego, upwards or downwards, and in some other cases. So I was wondering whether one could start addressing the parametric variation in the non-functional lexicon, which I think has been kind of neglected as a possibility. I was wondering what you might think of it in general terms. I don't know. It's
yeah, that's a very, I really hadn't thought about that. That's a very interesting proposal. I mean, there was this work in the 50s, right, by various American anthropologists, Lounsbury and someone else,
Lounsbury,
on
compositional something.
Yeah. Because obviously once you start to look at sort of indigenous languages of North America, you see kinship systems which are really very different and do seem to be decomposable, both semantically and in some cases, I think, formally, right, in terms of the morphemes that make up the words for things like uncle and grandparent and nephew and so on. So, I mean, I guess... Well, the question would be to what extent notions of deficiency and redundancy would be relevant there, given what Dalina and I are trying to say. But it's certainly an interesting thing to think about. Do you think there's any other lexical? I mean, the kinship domain is a very interesting one, but do you think there's any other lexical domain where something like that might apply?
I think it's all over. I mean, if you take again presto in Italian, which corresponds to soon, early, and quickly.
Yeah.
Again, there might be features that are shared by these English soon, early, and which are covered by one morpheme in Italian, presto, that you know very well. So I think it's quite widespread. And I was wondering, I mean, this has been an area where our theory has not yet entered, so to speak.
That's true.
And I think that your way of looking at features certainly go above, I mean, beyond the formal features, so to speak. But they are formal features even in the non-functional lexicon. So, I mean, this is a very wild conjecture. I don't know. But I think it could...
Yeah, it's certainly worth thinking about, definitely.
Okay.
And maybe one should return to that earlier anthropological literature.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for it. Beautiful.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah.
Okay, any more questions or comments?
Maybe just a quick one. Oh, Howard first. You can go ahead, Howard.
Can you hear me this time?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Since the comments on Ian's wonderful talk seem to be over, I wanted to just inform people of something excellent that happened recently. Lydia, as you know, is in charge of the linguistics program at Cleveland State University. It came this close to being eliminated, but Lydia led a powerful movement to save it, and she's on the verge of succeeding. So we should congratulate her for that.
Yeah, yeah. Congratulations. Yeah.
Yeah, if anybody's program is in trouble, I can share what we did to keep it alive. Thanks, Howard. Is that all? Did you have another? Yeah, that's it. Well, thanks. Robert.
Yeah, just back to the talk, but thanks for that, Howard, and good work, Lydia, on that. That's really great work. Ian, just if you want to sort of analogize on the issue you bring up about sort of the constancies, the unparameterizable parts, you see the same thing just in logic, right? I mean, you don't parameterize modus ponens or basic rules of inference, but in the model theory, you can have all sorts of parameterizations over the model, but not over the rules of derivation. Those would not be, those would be constant notions, which should not be parameterized. Now, you're not really dealing with the kind of comparative notions in logic, but I think, since the internal structure is really based on logical systems of the theory, you really do get this division between the sort of things which are just the system, right? And those things which can be sort of parameterized relative to the core fixed part of the constant part of the system. There are issues about constancies of logical terms and other things about that are deeply investigated. But I think there's easy analogies between, say, modus ponens and merge in their kind of relations to the overall system. So, analogically, you might want to sort of rely on that as a way of sort of thinking about what you would see as what would be possibly to be parameterized and what sort of just not the kind of thing because of its structural nature within the system that you would just not ask the question about parameterization.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting analogy, and it recalls something that Chomsky always said, and again, this is in the very early work, that a linguistic derivation or a syntactic derivation is analogous to a proof.
Right, of course.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Okay. Lydia?
Yes, I have a couple of very quick questions. One was about the arrow notation with the features. So when you have 2 or 3 features and then the arrow tells you what that amounts to, is that a formal notation or is it just for expository purposes? How do you view that notation?
So
and another question. Oh, go ahead.
No, so could we see which slides did you have in mind?
When you were discussing the number of features with the roll up.
Oh yeah, no, that's just think of that as very approximately and very simplistically just an old style transformational rule, right? So on the left of the arrow is the structural description, on the right of the arrow is the structural change.
So how do you view that in what place does it have in the system? Is it a new notation of some sort? Like how does it live within merge a minimalist framework?
It's just internal merge.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Internal merge.
I see. So that's how I see that. That's what that means. Okay. Another question: if some of the evaluation metric is already in internal merge that doesn't need an extra one, would one need that deficiency metric to coexist with something that's already kind of built in? Is that not too rich? Or is there a movement toward having them all built in as far as evaluation metrics, or would some of them still be abstractly defined with deficiency and things like that?
Oh, well, no, I mean the question, there's 2 separate questions. What is the intentional definition of a formal feature, and then the evaluation metric operates over formal features, essentially counts them. That's the basic idea. So the first thing is figure out what it is you're counting, and then apply the metric to count them. So the part about the Borer-Chomsky conjecture was about figuring out what to count. Okay, because the Borer-Chomsky conjecture doesn't give us a clear enough picture, and what Delina and I are attempting to do is to refine. I mean, as I said, we don't want to drop the idea of the Borer-Chomsky conjecture in the sense of dropping the idea either of formal feature in itself or the idea that that is a locus of parametric variation. But what we do want to do is refine what the Borer-Chomsky conjecture says, because as it stands, the Borer-Chomsky conjecture is really very weak. So we essentially want to strengthen it. Then your evaluation metric. See, that becomes what in the very early terminology is the fixed notation, and then which constitutes the grammars, and then you evaluate those, right? So you evaluate the grammars in relation to those. There's a sense in which you can't evaluate a grammar in relation to something which is absolutely fixed, part of the system, as Robert was just saying. So you can't evaluate a system in relation to merge, because merge is just what constitutes the system in a certain sense, right? It builds the structures. So that's not, but what you can do is evaluate a system in relation to the incidence of formal features. And so this last part was about how we should define the formal features. Okay.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
So we're over 2 hours. At this point, we usually ask Ian if he's willing to hang out for a little bit longer. And if he is, can go on, because I see Charles has another question. And if not, we'll wrap up. How do you feel, Ian?
Oh, I'm okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
The night is young.
Yeah. All right. So Charles, go ahead if you have a question.
Okay, I'll ask my question. It's kind of a big one. Well, maybe not. I've always been confused about something, and I was very happy, to see you talking about these things, but I can't tell if there's actually a big lack of parallel between the idea of evaluation metric and phonology and syntax, because I got the feeling, so correct me if I'm wrong, when you were laying out the issue in syntax, you say, you're characterizing Chomsky's discussion. The idea is that you've got a fixed theory, you've got UG or some fixed notational system, something like that. And then you evaluate, you compare grammars that are extensionally equivalent. And they're both, let's say you got two grammars that are extensionally equivalent and they're expressed in the same notational system. And then you can decide which one is better, right? Because let's say the one that's shorter or has fewer symbols. But when you go to your slide 12 and the discussion in SPE, I never really understood this, because I get the feeling that they're talking about something else sometimes, which is, let's see, I have a note here. Yeah, they say, again, you fix UG, but then you evaluate rules that might not be extensionally equivalent. And what you're doing is saying the rule that has fewer features expresses more of a linguistically significant generalization. Like as if something that says, delete consonants at the end of a word is better than something that says delete voice consonants at the end of the word. And sometimes that is used as a way of explaining language change, because the more general rule is a better rule. And I get the feeling that there's a big difference between these things. So I don't know, am I the only one confused by this?
Actually, the idea, when I first started to sort of question the postulation of input generalization, it really came from exactly this idea that in phonology, the more general rule has the fewer features, right? So delete a consonant at the end of a word is a simpler rule than delete a voiced consonant at the end of a word. It requires at least one less feature. Okay, I'm not a phonologist, but I'm guessing that's probably right.
Yeah, good enough.
Yeah. And so if you look at then what we had here in wherever it is, sorry, comparing, say this rule in 5 for Japanese with this rule in 10 for German, the German rule has one more feature. So it's a more marked rule. And the prediction then is that languages of the German type are cross-linguistically rarer than languages of the Japanese type, which seems to be true. I mean, with emphasis on seems, okay? Because it's a less highly valued system, because the roll-up rule makes reference to one more feature.
Yeah. The problem is if you apply that, if you extend that back to phonology, the best rule would be delete everything at the end of a word, right? Because that has the least specification, and that there doesn't seem to be any reason to believe that that's true. So I guess there's I don't know. There's more to think about. I don't even. I guess I'm trying to figure out if Chomsky himself is actually consistent in the use of the notion in phonology and syntax.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think the thing is that if you had a rule which said delete everything at the end of the word, what would be the concept of end of the word? Right. So I don't know. I mean, but yeah, I mean, see, yeah, it's a little different in the case of rollup because this is the simplest version of rollup, which applies to everything. Now there is actually something which I'll confess to now, having presented it all. It seems that languages of this type, where everything is really head final, are actually rarer than languages of the Japanese type, where you have head finality in the clause but not in the nominal. That may be true. It's difficult to be really sure because we have to rely on these large typological databases, which are unreliable in all kinds of ways, but it may be true. And that then suggests that there's some further constraint at work, which might favor a system of this kind. From the point of view of the formal operation of roll-up, though, 5 is more complex than 4. Right, for the simple reason that it makes reference to one further feature. Maybe there's some other aspect of the grammars of systems that have 4, which makes them more marked in some sense. That remains to be seen, if it's even true, right, empirically. So,
thank you.
Okay, Robert?
Yeah, Charles, there's a very nice point. I just wanted to follow up on it a little bit. I mean, the case you brought is a little tricky because, as you put on about the rule, it has to be a rule that's correct, right? I mean, if it's not right, you don't care. So
right.
that kind of doesn't matter whether it's simpler or better or what have you. But I do think you put your finger on a good point that's a little bit, I think, not quite crystallized in Ian's talk, perhaps, which is the difference between pure simplicity, which can be reduced to just symbol counting in some sense, perhaps a sophisticated symbol counting, but nevertheless, and simplicity, which leads to greater depth of generalization expressed by the system.
Mm-hmm.
Simplicity for its own sense, it may or may not be better. More complex systems may be better, even though they're essentially equivalent in some way, than in some sense it has less symbols. We don't know. That's working out an entire system. But the point that Chomsky was always making is that the notions in the notational conventions you assume, in particular, to say the most widely understood and discussed one, which is parenthesis notation, particularly in the early theory. And as when I brought this up in my talk, Howard pointed out to me, Chomsky utilizes it on page 43 of Aspects, which I've now memorized, Howard. But Chomsky makes exactly the point. The point is that if you take, the whole range of, expansions of the verb phrase at that time, and then you use the parenthesis notation, you get something which has less symbols, but also expresses a deep generalization about the nature of verb phrases.
Mm-hmm.
So the point about simplicity is directly connected to generalization. Simplicity without the connection to generalization is essentially not an interesting notion. And so I think you have to be very careful in that, yeah, there may be systems which are just looking at simplicity per se, count symbols, versus those that have notations within the fixed notation and conventions which allow for simpler grammars that express deeper generalizations.
Yeah. This point is there right from the beginning, actually. I don't know if I can find a quote quickly at this stage.
It's in LSLT for sure.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Howard, you Remember do you remember the citation offhand? The page?
Not on the top of my head.
You're slipping, Howard.
Well, I am. I'm just about 80 years old.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of implicit in this second quotation from Syntactic Structures here, because he says, when we evaluate a grammar once presented, meaning a grammar that sort of, works in some sense, then to compare it with other proposed grammars, we're thus interested in describing the form of grammars equivalently to the nature of linguistic structure. It's sort of implicit there, the point you're making, right? This isn't the best quote, actually, but
he does say this both in LSLT and aspects directly.
Yeah. And actually, in the early days of minimalism, at least, when people say, well, why are you doing this? He would say, well, look, every single time we've attempted to eliminate redundancy, the theory's advanced. So let's try and eliminate as much redundancy as possible.
Mm-hmm.
That was essentially, a motivation for the move from late GB to minimalism. So it's the same thinking, essentially.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody out there? Anybody would like to ask a question? Another comment? And if not, then Lydia. Oh yes,
Again, I got one more thing, which again I've been puzzling over recently. So in the paper that I put in the chat, so it's kind of fun to read this paper, partly because of all the snarky comments that Chomsky and Halley make to Householder. But at some point, they quote Householder as saying that Halley basically said this, that no symbol system may be judged economical unless it is always the case that the more general statement, when expressed in it, is shorter. And this is on page 137. And it sounded, I don't know, it sounded kind of reasonable to me. But Chomsky and Halley wrote that we don't know where, we can't find anything in Halley's papers that would lead anybody to conclude that such an absurd principle was being advocated. And when I read it, it seemed kind of reasonable to me. So I must be misunderstanding something there too. But if anyone has any insight, send me a message. It's on page 137.
Okay.
Yeah, that does sound reasonable. That sounds like just the point that Robert was making.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I'm completely confused.
Yeah.
Charles, I'll try and read the paper and send you a note.
Okay. It's highlighted on page 137.
Yeah, so I'll have a look at it and see if we can have a conversation.
Excellent.
Yeah, that's
Thanks.
great. Thanks. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, with that,
Okay,
Lydia,
I
you wanna
can,
wrap it up?
I can wrap up. Thank you so much, Ian, for your wonderful talk and discussion that everybody participated in. Thanks to the participants as well. Our next talk is by Rita Manzini, which is on June 27th, which is a Friday. We're switching to Fridays. If you remember the poll that we had, it came out split. Half the people prefer Friday and half the people prefer Saturday. And since we've been doing Saturdays all along, we decided to switch to Fridays for the next year, giving the Friday people a chance to attend. So June 27th, Rita Manzini, 12 p.m. EDT. And the title is Language Variation and Universals in Generative Models. So seems related and very, very interesting. We hope to see you there.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Well, thanks again for the invitation, and thanks to everyone for the questions and discussion. That was really helpful, actually. So.
Thank you very much for coming, everybody, and thank you very much, Ian. Okay.
Thank you. Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.